Welcome everyone to my latest post-playthrough thoughts and review video. Today, as usual, I'll be taking you guys through my thoughts and history with our latest game finished on stream. However, as this game is the first game outside of a series I've been through, I'll have to change it up just a teensy bit in terms of the history section. In this video, I'll be talking about Dontnod Entertainment's Vampyr, an interesting game that I think has kind of flown under the radar a bit. Let's jump right into it. For many years now, I've had a sort of fascination with vampires. Something about them just interests me greatly, and I find myself continually drawn to vampire media. Back in grade 12, I read Bram Stoker's Dracula for the first time and wrote an essay on its themes, and I had a fantastic time getting into the nitty-gritty of that novel. Different types of vampires, partially of my own design, are very prevalent in my D&D world as well. I'd yet to play a video game where vampires are the main focus before Vampyr, but I'd had my eye on Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines for a while, and I find myself playing vampires in The Sims more often than any other occult state. Vampyr itself came under my radar the day before its release, on June 4th, 2018. I was browsing Twitter at 11 PM, right before bed, and I found a story trailer on my feed. I was instantly captivated. The aesthetic of the game immediately appealed to me, and I was surprised no one was talking about this game. Sure, the developer was a little obscure, but how did I go until the game's actual release before hearing about it? When I saw a gameplay trailer, I immediately knew I had to play this game. The protagonist's movement was exactly the style of movement I'd pictured in some imaginary game I'd created in my mind long ago that I desperately wanted to play. This game had to be for me. Fortunately, I'd had a very brief obsession with fighting games at some point in 2016, and as a result of that, I had a PlayStation 4 collecting dust on my shelf. I'd kept Vampyr at the back of my mind for a few months until in early September, I spotted it on a store shelf. I grabbed it and waited for the time to be right. I wanted to play Breath of the Wild and Smash Bros. First. Finally, though, it was time for me to see exactly what this game had in store for me. Did Vampyr live up to the hype I'd created for myself? How did I feel about my first ever modern-style action RPG? Vampyr's trailer sucked me in immediately for good reason. The presentation is easily one of the best aspects of the game. The streets of London have an eerie beauty about them, augmented by the phenomenal soundtrack. Vampyr's soundtrack is characterized by thick and beautiful strings, droning choirs, and harsh industrial sounds, doing an excellent job at laying on the tension and emotion of each scene and environment. Graphically, the game is pretty fantastic in my eyes. Although not conventionally beautiful, the dismal, plague-ridden, blood-soaked streets of London are depicted very impressively here. As a purely audio-visual experience, Vampyr is stellar. From the moment you start the game, the narrative sucks you in. Within minutes, your character, Dr. Jonathan Reed, awakens from death as a vampire, and promptly murders his sister, blinded and controlled by his thirst. The first hour or so of gameplay then follows Jonathan as he tries to figure out what the hell has happened to him, vocalizing his confused thoughts. If there was any doubt remaining that I'd enjoy this game, the introduction erased it, being one of the most gripping introductions to a game that I've ever played. It should be evident from the intro that the narrative is an immensely important aspect of Vampyr, and as such I'm going to be very careful to avoid major spoilers while talking about it. At its core, Vampyr is a game about searching for answers in a very troubled time. Set in London in 1918, the era of the Spanish flu, Jonathan's quest revolves around discovering his maker and putting an end to the epidemic once and for all. And what do you do when you have questions? You ask someone. Vampyr's dialogue and characters are a fundamental part of the experience, and overall I think it's a fantastically executed system. Each of the 4 districts is populated by a distinct cast of characters, all independently voice acted very well, with their own thoughts, personality, and opinions on the current state of London. Nearly every character has their own secrets as well, which can be uncovered through investigation and side quests, which really serves to make every NPC feel like a real person. When a conversation has narrative bearing, the option that advances the plot is clearly defined with a yellow indicator, meaning you know how to extract the most information possible before moving on, if that sort of thing interests you. The one downside to this system, though? Once you've exhausted all of a character's dialogue options, there's really no reason to talk to them again for the sake of talking without learning a new hint about them ahead of time. This was a little disappointing to me, but with how many distinct characters you have to speak to, it's really not the end of the world. One of Vampyr's biggest draws is the dichotomy of Dr. Reed as both a vampire and a doctor, with benefits and drawbacks for indulging or neglecting those natures. Characters will get sick over time and will require medicine, which you can craft at your hideouts. Sick residents will lower the overall health status of their district, and without going into too much detail, a district that reaches critical status will become incredibly difficult to traverse. Characters can actually die from their sicknesses too, so it's important to keep an eye on those characters you care about. On top of that, the vampire side of Jonathan requires blood, which comes from those poor named NPCs you may care about. As you progress through the game, your mesmerized level increases, allowing you to lure more and more citizens to a dark corner to feast on their blood, granting you experience based on their blood quality. High-power citizens will have increased blood quality, augmented further by the number of secrets you know about them, and by their health. You can go through the entire game without feasting on a single citizen, however, outside of the completion of story missions and local investigations, this game's term for side quests, citizens are the only meaningful source of experience. Being a pacifist will leave you quite weak, with standard enemies sometimes being upwards of 8 levels higher than you, which is very manageable if you upgrade your weapons properly and play skillfully, but is of course difficult. The dichotomy of Dr. Reed is excellently implemented through gameplay, and it leads you to another core element of Vampyr: difficult decisions. Trying to do the right thing in this game can be a heart-wrenching and monumentally difficult task. With the given resources, you cannot give medicine to every citizen. You may have to sacrifice someone if you're not able to handle the high-power enemies. And hardest of all, at certain crucial moments of the story, you're forced to make a decision on the face of various important characters, whether they live or die, or whether you sacrifice something for them. Your decisions may have far-reaching consequences that could be unlikely to predict on your first playthrough, which makes these moments incredibly powerful, as long as you care about them. On my playthrough, I made a critical error that resulted in the deaths of a lot of people. Thanks to the sentimental nature of how I play games, I cared a lot about this mistake. But on the other hand, I was so close to the end of the game by this point that I never would have interacted with these people again anyway. I cared a lot about the consequences of my actions, but it definitely made me consider that the moral challenge of Vampyr is tied directly to your investment in it. Without being so captivated in the story, I have a feeling that some of these decisions may matter a lot less than I gave them credit for. Combat in this game feels fairly good for the most part, but remember as I described this section that my playthrough was borderline a pacifist run, and thus I was extremely underleveled the whole time. You have 3 meters to keep an eye on: health, stamina, and blood. All 3 should be fairly self-explanatory, as soon as I mention that blood is essentially a substitute for a conventional mana bar. You need stamina to dodge an attack, and you need blood to cast your abilities. You have 2 attack buttons, one for your main hand, highest damaged weapon, and one for your offhand weapon, either a ranged attack or a weapon that inflicts stun damage, or a bit of a combo. I never used any two-handed weapons which can block attacks. Enemies have both a health bar and a stun bar. When the stun bar is depleted, they can be bitten to restore your blood. Furthermore, there are 4 damage types: melee and ranged physical, as well as shadow and blood. Each enemy may have some resistances to these damage types, so although you may be forced to smack around a resistant enemy anyway, you can still vary your approach to each fight a bit to counteract this. Again, to reiterate, I found combat generally fun. It was very rewarding to dodge around a boss and fight such a high-power enemy one-on-one. Fights with large groups of enemies were also quite challenging. However, in situations where I was certainly not the underdog, combat could get a bit one-dimensional. If I was fighting a weaker enemy, especially once I'd leveled up my stamina a bit, all I really had to do was mash my square button. I was worried about this problem in the early game, and though I was pleasantly surprised that I did have to avoid spamming and fight smartly, getting stronger removed the requirement for intelligent combat in some instances. No matter your path through the game, I feel like there's going to be some disappointing element in combat. If you've killed citizens and you're quite strong, then I imagine general fights are a joke. If you're too weak, however, then although the general fights will challenge you, you have to play insanely well in boss fights. Otherwise, you'll be chipping them down at a snail's pace through stuns, since you'll desperately need blood to heal yourself otherwise. However, a boss fight being a skill test may not really be something to complain about. I had a lot of fun with most of the combat on my run, so it might be a bit disingenuous to say there's a disappointing element in combat regardless of your path. Another thing I'd like to complain about briefly is how odd the pre-win soldiers felt. In a game where nearly every character you interact with has a distinct personality, it's very strange for faceless goons to exist for combat, though I understand the need for them. Stranger, however, were the beasts in this game. Where did they come from? Are they ever explained? Beasts stand out as the most head-scratching inclusion of Vampyr, given that you can find answers to the presence of any other enemy class through the main story. Although I don't want to end on a negative note, I have to bring this up. The game on PS4 is plagued with bizarre technical issues and oversights with its text. The most obnoxious bug was an issue with invisible cooldowns. Sometimes the cooldown on an ability is improperly omitted, making it look like it's available when it's really not, which is most obnoxious in regards to your ultimate ability whose cooldown is very long. Loading times can be quite long sometimes. Subtitles occasionally display too early or too late, and text in conversation is riddled with typos or grammatical errors, despite Jonathan's actual voice lines being correct. I didn't even take note of many glitches in Skyrim, and though most of these bugs or technical issues don't break the game, they're quite annoying at times. Though I may have focused most of my criticisms into the latter half of the video, I have to reiterate that I enjoyed Vampyr quite a lot. In my opinion, it's sort of a flawed masterpiece, a real hidden gem that genuinely captivated me from start to finish. I'd be interested in revisiting the game at some point in the future to see how my decisions impact the story differently, and to see what hints I've missed. The game's combat is generally good despite my many complaints, but the narrative and aesthetic of the game elevate it to a much greater experience. Vampyr has my wholehearted recommendation, and I'm very glad I was fortunate enough to stumble across that trailer last summer. I'd like to thank all of you for watching this video. It really means a lot to me. Did you try Vampyr for yourself? If you did, I'd love to hear what you had to say about it as well, in the comments. If this is the first you've seen of my content, you can find me at twitch.tv/turkeysub23. And to those of you who shared this adventure in London with me, I'd like to thank you again. Everybody have a wonderful day, and take care.